Welcome to Dreamy Mystery. Here's what makes no sense about the earliest civilizations we know. They weren't just primitive tribes looking up at the stars with fear. No, the Sumerians, who gave us writing, cities, and the wheel, had a worldview so utterly alien to our modern sensibilities it almost defies belief. They didn't just worship gods. They believed their gods were flesh and blood beings who lived among them, ate their food, quarrelled amongst themselves, and crucially, demanded labour. We're talking about an entire pantheon of powerful entities, known as the Anunnaki, who, according to their own ancient texts, designed and built cities, established laws, and even engineered humanity itself. This wasn't some distant, ethereal heaven. It was a gritty, immediate, and often terrifying relationship with beings of immense power who walked the dusty plains of Mesopotamia. How could a civilization so incredibly advanced for its time, inventing mathematics, astronomy, complex legal codes, also hold such a literal, almost industrial view of the divine? It's a paradox that sits at the very heart of their existence, and it hints at a story far more intricate than simple myth. This isn't just about faith, it's about a claimed history, etched into clay tablets, describing a time when gods were not just metaphors, but literal rulers. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious. Drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world. Let's start with the obvious question nobody asks. Why would the most powerful beings in the cosmos need humans to do anything at all? Think about that for a second. If you possess advanced knowledge, incredible strength, and perhaps even the ability to shape reality, why would you bother with a fragile, short-lived species like ours? This isn't the benevolent, distant deity of later monotheistic religions. The Anunnaki, as depicted in thousands of cuneiform tablets unearthed from the sands of ancient Mesopotamia, weren't just powerful. They were present, and they had very specific, very demanding needs that only humanity could apparently fulfill. Our story begins in what archaeologists call the Ubaid period, roughly 6500 to 4000 BCE, in a land that would become known as Sumer. This was the true dawn of civilization, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq. Here, in the Fertile Crescent, something extraordinary happened. Small scattered settlements began to coalesce, growing into the world's first true cities. Places like Eridu, Uruk, Ur and Nippur weren't just larger villages. They were complex urban centres with monumental architecture, organised labour, and sophisticated irrigation systems that transformed arid land into verdant agricultural zones. By 4500 BCE, Eridu, considered the oldest city by the Sumerians themselves, was already a bustling hub. Its central feature an imposing temple dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom and water. This wasn't just a place of worship, it was, in the Sumerian worldview, the home of the god, a place where the divine and human realms intersected in a very tangible way. The discovery of these cities, and more importantly, the vast libraries of cuneiform tablets within them, radically reshaped our understanding of ancient history. These wedge-shaped inscriptions, painstakingly pressed into wet clay, documented everything from mundane administrative records, like how many bushels of barley were harvested, to elaborate legal codes, epic poems, and detailed cosmological narratives. It's in these ancient texts, dating back as far as 2500 BCE, that we first encounter the Anunnaki. The name itself, Anunnaki, is usually translated as quote, or quote. They were the pantheon, the council of the great gods of Sumer, born of An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess. These weren't abstract concepts. They had names: Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, and distinct personalities, often depicted with human-like flaws and virtues. They were the creators, the rulers, and the ultimate arbiters of justice in the Sumerian universe. What's genuinely weird about this is the sheer physicality ascribed to them. The Anunnaki weren't just spiritual entities. They had bodies, they ate, they drank, they lived in elaborate temples, which were effectively their palaces on Earth. They experienced joy, anger, jealousy, and sometimes even made monumental mistakes. Think about the ziggurats, those massive stepped pyramids that dominated the skylines of Sumerian cities. These weren't merely symbolic structures. They were considered the actual residences of the gods, built to house them and provide a suitable environment for their earthly stay. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, for instance, constructed around 2100 BCE, was dedicated to Nana, the moon god. It was a colossal multi-story structure, its bricks fired and mortared with bitumen, reaching towards the heavens not just as an offering, but as a direct connection point for the divine. The temple complex at its base wasn't just for priests. It was where the daily needs of the gods, their food offerings, their ceremonial garments, their entertainment, were meticulously managed. This intimate relationship permeated every aspect of Sumerian life. The concept of me, for example, was central. These were divine decrees or laws, a set of universal principles and cultural achievements, everything from kingship and priesthood to musical instruments and weaving, that were bestowed upon humanity by Enki, the god of wisdom. The me were not discovered by humans, they were given. This suggests a top-down, almost instructional approach to civilization itself. Kingship, for instance, was considered to have descended from heaven. A human king wasn't just a powerful leader, he was a steward, a proxy for the gods, tasked with maintaining the divine order and ensuring the continued satisfaction of the Anunnaki. His legitimacy came directly from their approval, and his primary duty was to serve their will, often expressed through elaborate rituals and temple building. The implications of this belief system are profound. If your rulers are literally the representatives of divine beings who walk among you, then the social structure, the legal system, even the very purpose of human existence, takes on a different meaning. The Epic of Atrahasis, one of the most complete ancient Mesopotamian creation myths, explicitly states that humanity was created to relieve the Anunnaki of their arduous labor. Specifically, the Sastos quote 3. A lower order of Anunnaki were tired of digging canals and mining precious minerals, so Enki and Ninhursag, the mother goddess, took clay and the blood of a slain god, fashioning the first humans to bear the god's burdens. This isn't a story of humanity as the pinnacle of creation, but as a functional workforce, a divine solution to a labor problem, and we're only getting started. The idea that gods would need to be relieved of labor, or that they would come to Earth for specific resources, is a fascinating thread that leads us down many paths. But before we delve into the contentious questions of why they came, and the incredible stories of their arrival, we first need to understand the hierarchy of these powerful beings and the specific roles they played in shaping not just Sumerian civilization, but perhaps the very trajectory of human history. That's a story for the next chapter, when we explore the cosmic politics of the Anunnaki and the initial reasons for their journey to our world. We left off with a truly mind-bending concept. Humanity was created not out of divine love or as the pinnacle of creation, but as a direct, functional solution to a very real, very pressing labour problem. The Igigi, those lower-ranking Anunnaki, were tired. They were exhausted from the back-breaking work of digging canals, constructing monumental structures, and most importantly, mining. But this begs an even bigger question, doesn't it? If the Anunnaki were these incredibly advanced, powerful beings capable of interstellar travel and genetic engineering, why were they here on Earth in the first place? What resource was so vital, so utterly necessary, that they would cross vast cosmic distances, establish colonies, and then resort to creating a slave race to extract it? This, my friends, is where our journey takes an even more intriguing turn, diving headfirst into the very core of Sumerian cosmology. Because the tablets don't just tell us that humanity was created, they tell us why the Anunnaki needed anything at all from this planet. And the answer, etched into thousands of cuneiform texts, is both simple and profoundly unsettling. Gold. Think about that for a moment. Not some exotic energy source, not a rare crystal with mystical properties, but gold. The very same precious metal that has captivated humanity for millennia, driving conquests, shaping economies, and adorning our most sacred artifacts. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki's need for gold was not a metaphor. It was a literal industrial requirement. According to the ancient texts and the interpretations that follow, the Anunnaki hailed from a planet the Sumerians called Nibiru. Now, this isn't a planet recognized by modern astronomy, and we'll delve much deeper into its disputed existence later in our series. But for the Sumerians, Nibiru was as real as the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It was described as a massive celestial body with an incredibly elongated elliptical orbit, taking thousands of our Earth years to complete a single revolution around our Sun. This meant Nibiru would periodically swing close to Earth, making interstellar travel between the two planets feasible, albeit a long and arduous journey. The story goes that Nibiru was facing an existential crisis. Its atmosphere was eroding, threatening the very existence of its inhabitants, and the proposed solution? To create a shield of fine gold particles in their upper atmosphere to reflect radiation and stabilize their planet's environment. A truly advanced, almost sci-fi solution, isn't it? And where was the most readily available source of this life-saving gold? Earth. So, picture this. A vast, unknown period of time ago, the Anunnaki embarked on this monumental journey. They weren't coming as conquerors in the traditional sense, but as desperate colonists on a mission of planetary salvation. Their arrival on Earth, as described in fragmented texts, would have been nothing short of spectacular, heralded by massive, fiery descents from the sky. These, quote for, weren't arriving on chariots pulled by mythical beasts. They were arriving in what can only be described as celestial vessels. The initial landing site is often associated with the region of ancient Mesopotamia, specifically the area around the Persian Gulf, where the earliest Sumerian cities would eventually rise. And almost immediately the work began. This wasn't a leisurely exploration. It was an urgent resource extraction operation. The first wave of Anunnaki, led by figures like Enki, the brilliant chief scientist and engineer, began setting up their base of operations. They established what the tablets refer to as the Eden, a term that some scholars interpret as quote 5 or simply quote 6, but which, in a more literal sense, referred to their initial settlements in the fertile plains. These early settlements weren't just simple camps. They were complex, organized outposts designed to facilitate the mining and processing of gold. And who was doing the grunt work? The Igigi. Imagine the scene. Vast swathes of land not yet populated by human cities being systematically explored and exploited. The Igigi, a multitude of Anunnaki, likely numbering in the thousands, were tasked with the arduous labour of mining the precious metal. They dug deep into the earth, establishing mining operations in what we now understand to be parts of Africa, where gold deposits were and still are abundant. They toiled in the heat, under the command of their superiors, the great Anunnaki lords like Enlil, the chief commander on earth, and Enki, who oversaw the scientific and engineering aspects. This wasn't a romanticized vision of divine creation. This was an industrial enterprise. The Sumerian texts describe their tools, their methods, their systematic approach to extracting the gold. It was hard, relentless labor, day in and day out, for what must have felt like an eternity for these beings. For thousands of years the Igigi bore this burden. They dug the shafts, hauled the ore, and processed the raw material. But even gods, it seems, have their limits. The strain, the monotony, the sheer physicality of the labor began to take its toll. The Igigi, though beings of immense power compared to future humanity, were not immune to fatigue, frustration, and eventually resentment. They were the working class of the Anunnaki, the ones who performed the dirty, dangerous, and demanding tasks, while the sect, quote 7, Anunnaki, the higher-ranking council members, made the decisions and oversaw the grand project. This established a clear hierarchy, a cosmic class system. At the very top was Anu, the distant sky god on Nibiru, the ultimate authority. On Earth, his sons, Enlil and Enki, held immense power, often clashing in their approaches to managing the colony and its resources. Beneath them were the other great Anunnaki, the council members, and then, at the bottom of this divine pecking order, were the Igigi. The Sumerian epic, the Atrahasis, paints a vivid picture of this divine unrest. It describes the Igigi's growing weariness, their complaints echoing through the divine councils. They had been toiling for 40 periods, a vast, unspecified amount of time, but clearly long enough. They started to grumble, to question the fairness of their endless labour. And then it happened. The Igigi rebelled. Imagine the shock, the outrage among the higher Anunnaki. Their workforce, their lower-ranking brethren, had laid down their tools. The mining operations, vital for Nibiru's survival, ground to a halt. The Igigi, in a dramatic act of defiance, burned their tools and surrounded Enlil's residence, demanding an end to their servitude. This wasn't a subtle protest. This was a strike, a full-blown mutiny in the divine ranks. Enlil, ever the stern commander, was furious. He wanted to punish them, to put down the rebellion with force. But Enki, the wise and resourceful scientist, saw a different path. He understood the Igigi's plight, and more importantly, he saw a way to solve the problem permanently, a way that would free the Anunnaki from manual labor forever. This is the pivotal moment, the flashpoint that leads directly to our existence. Enki, with the support of the mother goddess Ninhursag, proposed a radical solution. Create a primitive worker, a being that could bear the yoke of labor, a species designed specifically for the task of mining gold and serving the Anunnaki. And thus, the decision was made. Humanity, as we know it, was not an accident, not a spontaneous evolutionary leap. According to the Sumerian tablets, we were a deliberate, calculated project, a genetic engineering marvel crafted in the Yamnai, quote 9, a kind of divine laboratory from the quote 10 and, crucially, quote 11. This, quote 12, is where the story gets incredibly literal. It wasn't just symbolic, it was the genetic material, the essence of the Anunnaki, infused into the nascent human form. This is why, the texts suggest, humanity possesses a spark of divine intelligence, a capacity for reason and innovation that sets us apart from other earthly creatures. We carry within our very DNA a tiny echo of our creators. The first humans, often referred to as the Lulu Amelu, or primitive workers, were not designed for long lives or complex philosophical thought. They were engineered for endurance, for obedience, for the singular purpose of serving the Anunnaki. They were strong, resilient, and, most importantly, expendable. Their lives were short, their existence laborious, and their purpose clear: to dig for gold, to tend the fields of the gods, and to build their cities. So when we look back at the monumental ziggurats and elaborate temples of Sumer, we're not just seeing places of abstract worship, we're seeing the offices and residences of the Anunnaki, built and maintained by a workforce they engineered specifically for that task. We're seeing the logistical hubs of a vast interstellar mining operation, managed by beings who, despite their power, needed human hands to achieve their planetary salvation. This isn't just a quaint myth, is it? It's a detailed, almost industrial account of our origins, written in stone and clay by a civilization that claimed to have witnessed it firsthand. It challenges everything we think we know about evolution, about divine creation, and about our place in the cosmos. But the story doesn't end with our creation. Oh no. Once humanity was on the scene, a whole new set of challenges and complexities arose for the Anunnaki. How would they manage this new species? What were the unforeseen consequences of giving a part of themselves to these primitive workers? And what happened next, when the Anunnaki's grand project of planetary salvation eventually reached its conclusion? We're about to uncover the intricate web of divine politics, human development, and cosmic interventions that followed the creation of humanity. The story of our early interactions with our creators and the dramatic events that shaped our ancient past awaits us in our next chapter. Now let's pick up the thread right where we left off. Humanity, the Lulu Amelu, the quote 15 had been engineered, not as a crowning glory of creation, not as beings made in the image of a benevolent god for love or companionship, but as a solution, a divine biological solution to a very earthly labor problem. Think about that for a moment. Our existence, according to the Sumerians, began with a job description, and what a job it was. The Anunnaki had their gold mines, their cities to build, their canals to dig, their massive temples, their homes to maintain. And now they had an inexhaustible, self-replicating workforce. For a time, it must have seemed like the perfect arrangement. We imagine the plains of Mesopotamia, once primarily tended by the Igigi, now teeming with human activity. Humans, tireless and obedient, toiled under the watchful eyes of their divine overseers. They mined the precious gold, hauled the heavy stones, laid the foundations of the world's first true cities, Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Nippur. This wasn't some abstract spiritual service. This was physical labor. The Anunnaki weren't just receiving prayers, they were receiving results. They needed resources, and humanity delivered. We're talking about a period where the gods walked among us, not as ethereal spirits, but as powerful rulers who lived in colossal structures, ate food, drank, and demanded their due. Their needs were specific, their commands absolute, and humanity's purpose was clear: to serve. The Anunnaki established order. They didn't just create humanity and then leave us to our own devices. Oh no, they were deeply involved in the day-to-day management of this new species. They designed our cities, dictated our laws, and established the very fabric of our earlier societies. We call these, Ras, quote 16, the Me, a collection of rules, arts, crafts, and institutions that governed everything from priesthood to prostitution, from music to warfare. Enki, the god of wisdom, played a pivotal role in bestowing these Me upon humanity, essentially downloading the operating system for civilization directly into our nascent minds. These were the first, quote 17, not just symbolic figures, but literal rulers. They sat on thrones, issued edicts, and enforced compliance. The kings of Sumer weren't just earthly monarchs, they were stewards, direct representatives of the Anunnaki, tasked with ensuring humanity remained productive and subservient. What's genuinely weird about this is the sheer literalness of it all. There's no ambiguity in the cuneiform tablets. The gods weren't metaphors, they were the bosses. But here's where the story takes a turn, a twist that feels almost human. Because even the best laid plans of gods can go awry, especially when dealing with biological entities designed for replication. Humanity, it turned out, was incredibly good at what it was designed to do: survive, adapt, and multiply. And multiply we did. Think about the sheer scale of the Anunnaki's ambition. They needed a workforce, and they got one. A growing workforce. Over generations, the human population exploded across the Fertile Crescent. What was once a manageable solution began to become a problem. Imagine a small, pristine garden suddenly overrun by an invasive species, no matter how useful that species initially seemed. The Sumerian texts describe it with a fascinatingly relatable divine frustration. Humanity became noisy. Quote 18. The gods lamented. Quote 19. Can you imagine? The all-powerful Anunnaki, bothered by the sheer din of their own creation. It wasn't about malice, not initially, but irritation. A constant buzzing annoyance that disrupted their peace, their grand designs, their very ability to rest. This growing annoyance found its most potent voice in Enlil. Remember Enlil? The stern, authoritarian god, the one who bore the brunt of the Igigi's rebellion, the one who demanded order and discipline. He had initially been skeptical of Enki's plan to create humanity, and now his worst fears were being realized. His patience, never particularly abundant, wore thin. He saw humanity not as a marvel, but as an uncontrollable infestation. Enlil decided something had to be done. The solution? To curtail humanity, to reduce their numbers, to silence their incessant clamour. His initial methods were harsh, but from his perspective perhaps practical. He unleashed plagues upon the earth, hoping to thin the human herd. He orchestrated famines, causing crops to wither and rivers to dry, believing starvation would quell the burgeoning populations. Droughts followed, turning fertile lands into dust, all designed to bring humanity back into line, or perhaps to erase them entirely. Yet, even in the face of Enlil's wrath, humanity persevered. And crucially, Enki, our original genetic engineer, hadn't completely abandoned his creation. Enki, the god of wisdom and water, the one who held a more nuanced view of humanity, found ways to intervene. He would secretly communicate with a favoured human, a righteous man, providing him with the knowledge to avert the worst of the calamities. He taught them how to build irrigation systems to counter the droughts, how to store grain against the famines, how to seek out medicinal herbs to fight the plagues. He was, in a sense, acting as a divine whisperer, a protector from his more volatile brethren. But Enlil's frustration only mounted. His lesser measures had failed to achieve the desired result. The clamour continued. The cities swelled. Humanity, this engineered workforce, had become a monumentally inconvenient problem. And so, Enlil made a terrible, definitive decision. He called for a gathering of the Anunnaki Council, a fateful assembly where the ultimate fate of humanity would be sealed. His proposal was stark, absolute, and chilling. A global cataclysm. A great flood. Yes, that great flood. The one that echoes through countless ancient cultures and sacred texts across the world. But here, in the Sumerian context, it wasn't an act of divine sorrow or a consequence of human sin in the traditional sense. It was a deliberate, calculated act of population control, a cosmic reset button pressed by a god whose peace had been disturbed. Enlil decreed that humanity, the noisy, troublesome experiment, should be wiped from the face of the earth. The other Anunnaki, perhaps weary of the constant human din themselves, or perhaps simply unwilling to defy Enlil, agreed to the decree. A terrible oath was sworn. No god would warn humanity. This was to be a clean slate. But Enki, our progenitor, the one who crafted us from the clay and the blood, could not bring himself to allow the total annihilation of his creation. He had seen their resilience, their ingenuity, their spark. He felt a connection, a responsibility that transcended Enlil's decree. He was bound by the oath not to warn humanity, but Enki, ever the clever one, found a loophole. He decided he would speak not directly to a human, but to a reed hut, to the very walls of a dwelling where a favoured human, a man of great devotion and wisdom, lived. He would impart the instructions to build a vessel, an ark, to save a remnant of humanity, and with them the seeds of all life on earth. He would defy Enlil's absolute decree, not by breaking his oath directly, but by bending it, by finding a path through the divine law. This secret intervention, this act of divine rebellion, sets the stage for one of the most pivotal events in our story. The stage is set. The gods have made their decision. The waters are gathering. And one man, guided by a rebellious god, is about to embark on a journey that will determine the very survival of our species. Join us next time as we delve into the terrifying reality of the Great Flood, the desperate struggle for survival, and the profound implications of humanity's rebirth under the watchful and often warring eyes of the Anunnaki. What happened after the deluge? And how did the Anunnaki react to Enki's ultimate defiance? The answers, as always, are stranger than fiction. And then the deluge. The skies didn't just open, They ripped. Imagine the sound, if you can, of the very fabric of the heavens tearing asunder. For 7 days and 7 nights, the world was plunged into a maelstrom unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed or could even comprehend. The Sumerian tablets, our ancient eyewitness accounts, describe it vividly. Quote 20. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't just a heavy rainstorm. This was a cosmic event. The very foundations of the world, as humanity knew it, were being erased. We're talking about a global catastrophe, a force so immense that it would have made even the Anunnaki, these powerful flesh and blood gods, pause. From their sky chariots, or perhaps from the highest peaks of their ziggurats, the Anunnaki watched. And what did they see? Not just a cleansing, but an absolute horrifying annihilation. The tablets tell us that even the great gods were terrified. Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, cried out like a woman in travail. She, along with others, wept openly, lamenting the destruction of their creations. My people, as she called them, now turned to clay floating on the surface of the waters. Enlil, the architect of this destruction, who had so vehemently demanded humanity's obliteration, was not immune to the horror. There's a distinct possibility that even he felt the profound weight of what he had unleashed, though his pride would prevent him from admitting it. The sheer scale of the devastation, the raw, unbridled power of the elements, must have been a sobering sight even for beings who commanded such forces. But amidst the chaos, one tiny vessel, crafted with sacred knowledge and desperate hope, rode the monstrous waves. Utnapishtim, the righteous man warned by Enki, had followed the instructions to the letter. He had loaded his ark with his family, his craftsmen, and... Quote 23. For those 7 terrifying days and nights, while civilization drowned, while the very memory of humanity was meant to be expunged, life clung precariously to that single, bobbing sanctuary. When the storm finally subsided, when the quote 24 retreated and the sun, a sight of almost unbearable hope, broke through the bruised, watery sky, the world was reborn as a vast, silent ocean. Only the highest mountain peaks pierced the endless expanse of water. Utnapishtim's ark, guided by forces unseen, eventually came to rest on Mount Nisir. Imagine the silence, the profound, suffocating silence after the roar of the flood. Utnapishtim, following ancient rituals, released a dove, then a swallow, then a raven, waiting for a sign of dry land. When the raven did not return, he knew it was safe. He disembarked, and his first act, his absolute priority, was to offer a sacrifice to the gods. He built an altar, gathered reeds, cedar, and myrtle, and lit the fire. And this is where our story takes a genuinely weird turn, where the very human-like nature of the Anunnaki is laid bare. The scent of Utnapishtim's offering, the sweet aroma of roasted sacrifice wafted up to the heavens. The Sumerian texts describe it with almost comical directness. The gods smelled the sweet savour, and they gathered like flies around the sacrificer. Like flies. Think about that. These powerful, royal, spacefaring beings, the architects of civilization, were drawn by the smell of food after days, weeks, perhaps even months of famine. Because remember, humanity's primary purpose was labour, yes, but also sustenance for the gods. Without human hands tilling the soil, harvesting crops and preparing offerings, the Anunnaki themselves were deprived. They needed humanity for their food, their drink, their very comfort. This is the true stark paradox of the Anunnaki. They were mighty, they were creators, they were the quote 26, but they were also profoundly dependent. As the Anunnaki descended, drawn by the tantalizing aroma, their eyes fell upon Utnapishtim and his family. And then the realization hit. Humanity had survived. Enlil, the stern commander, was beside himself with rage. His fury, which had fueled the flood, now boiled over. Quote 27. He thundered. Quote 28. The other gods cowered, knowing the weight of Enlil's wrath. But Enki, the cunning and compassionate god of wisdom and water, stepped forward. "I did it," he admitted, though perhaps with a slight smirk. "I did not break my oath. I did not tell humanity. I merely sent a dream, a vision, a sign. It was up to Utnapishtim to interpret it." This wasn't just Enki's compassion speaking, it was his pragmatism. He understood, perhaps better than Enlil, the fundamental need the Anunnaki had for humanity. Without them, who would mine the gold? Who would build the temples? Who would provide the offerings that sustained them, that brought them together like flies around a meal? The very fabric of their existence on Earth relied on humanity. The ensuing debate among the Anunnaki must have been epic. Enlil, humiliated and furious, advocated for a second, more thorough destruction. But others, perhaps still shaken by the flood, perhaps hungry, perhaps swayed by Enki's logical arguments about the necessity of a workforce, began to waver. This is where the Anunnaki Council, these powerful, squabbling, all-too-human gods, had to make a choice, and they made a practical one. They needed humanity. They needed their labor, their offerings, their service. The grand experiment of creating a quote 32 had been too successful to simply abandon. Reluctantly, Enlil conceded, but not without a price. He approached Utnapishtim and his wife, not to destroy them, but to bestow upon them a unique blessing, immortality. They, and they alone, would be taken to a distant land, beyond the quote 33, to live forever. This was a peculiar reward, a way to acknowledge Enki's cleverness and Utnapishtim's obedience, while also ensuring that these specific humans, who now held the secret of the gods' fallibility, were removed from the general population. They were given a special status, a testament to their extraordinary survival. So humanity was saved, not out of divine, unconditional love, but out of divine necessity. What's genuinely weird about this isn't just the survival, but the reason for it. We weren't saved because we were inherently good or worthy in some abstract sense. We were saved because we were useful. We were a resource. We were the solution to a labor problem, and that problem still existed, even after the flood. The post-flood world was a desolate canvas. The great cities of Sumer, once bustling centers of Anunnaki rule and human labor, were gone, buried under layers of silt and memory. But with humanity's survival came the mandate to rebuild. The Anunnaki, perhaps having learned a harsh lesson about the fragility of their workforce, would now guide humanity into a new era. This wasn't just about starting over. It was about re-establishing the delicate balance between gods and mortals. The Anunnaki still needed their gold, still needed their temples, still needed their offerings, and humanity, now acutely aware of their precarious existence, would redouble their efforts to serve their creators. The relationship, however, had fundamentally changed. The gods had shown their capacity for extreme wrath, and humanity had proven its resilience, albeit with divine intervention. The direct, almost casual interaction between gods and humans might have lessened somewhat. The Anunnaki, perhaps retreating more into their grand temples and ziggurats, would continue to rule, but perhaps with a renewed appreciation for their indispensable workforce. Our story, however, is far from over. Humanity had survived the ultimate test, but what kind of world would they build? What new roles would the Anunnaki carve out for themselves and for us in this reborn world? And what about the gold? That precious metal, the original reason for their journey to Earth, still needed to be mined. The cosmic purpose, the very reason the Anunnaki came to Earth, remained. Join us next time as we delve into the aftermath of the Great Flood, the re-establishment of civilization, and the ongoing complex relationship between the Anunnaki and their human creation. Because the saga of Jesus, quote 34, truly begins anew in the wake of the greatest catastrophe. The waters receded, leaving behind a world scoured clean, a vast, desolate canvas of mud and memory. Imagine it, the silence, broken only by the drip of water from sodden cliffs, the distant rumble of settling earth. A testament to Enlil's rage, yes, but also a stark reminder of the Anunnaki's fundamental problem. The earth, their temporary mining outpost, was now a wasteland, and their only workforce, humanity, was reduced to a handful of survivors on a single ark. This wasn't just a moment of reflection for the Anunnaki, it was a crisis. Their planet, Nibiru, still needed that precious gold to mend its failing atmosphere. The flood had been a reset button, but it hadn't erased the imperative. If anything, it had amplified it. The Anunnaki, these incredibly powerful, technologically advanced beings, suddenly found themselves in a bind. Their grand cosmic project, their very survival, hinged on a species they had almost obliterated. So, what happened next? The Anunnaki, gathered around Utnapishtim's smoking altar, had made their reluctant peace with humanity's survival. Enlil, still fuming, had been forced to concede. But this concession wasn't born of compassion. It was born of necessity. Humanity was no longer just an experiment. It was an indispensable asset. And the Anunnaki, pragmatists above all else, wasted no time in re-establishing control and setting their grand plan back into motion. Our story, then, picks up in the immediate aftermath, in a world utterly transformed. The task was monumental: rebuild, re-terraform, and, most critically, remobilize humanity. Utnapishtim and his family, now immortal and relocated, were out of the picture. The remaining humans, a terrified, bewildered few, were once again face to face with their creators, their former taskmasters. But this time, the relationship would be different, more structured, more efficient. Think about it from the Anunnaki perspective. They had lost everything they'd built on Earth: the mines, the processing plants, the cities, the vast infrastructure designed to extract and transport gold. The flood had been a catastrophic setback. Now, they needed to start almost from scratch, and they needed humanity to do it. This wasn't about simply ordering humans to dig again. It was about creating a system that would prevent future rebellions, ensure maximum output, and integrate humanity fully into their long-term objectives. This is where we see the Anunnaki transition from mere overseers to active architects of human civilization. Before the flood, humanity was a tool. After the flood, humanity became a project. Enki, the master geneticist and engineer, whose cunning had saved humanity, now stepped forward as its primary guide. He understood his creation better than any other Anunnaki, and he knew how to make it work. The first priority was sustenance. A hungry workforce is an unproductive one. The Anunnaki, through Enki and Ninhursag, began to impart knowledge that would transform the scattered primitive survivors into organized cultivators. We're talking about the systematic introduction of agriculture, how to domesticate wild grains, how to irrigate vast fields, how to store harvests. We see the emergence of advanced animal husbandry, not just for food but for labor. Beasts of burden to aid in ploughing and transport. This wasn't just a matter of survival, it was about creating a surplus, a steady supply of food, to free up human hands for the more arduous tasks of mining and construction. What's genuinely weird about this, if you think about it, is that these, quote 35, weren't just giving humanity abstract blessings. They were giving literal practical instructions. Here's how you build a plough. Here's how you dig a canal. Here's the best seed for this soil. This isn't the stuff of typical divine intervention. It's the detailed instruction manual from a superior intelligence to a subordinate one. As humanity's numbers slowly began to recover, the Anunnaki started to establish the framework for their new world order. The great cities of Sumer, Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Nippur, didn't just spring up out of nowhere. They were meticulously planned and constructed, often on the very sites of pre-flood settlements. These weren't merely human dwellings, they were operational centers. At the heart of each city was the ziggurat, a massive stepped pyramid that towered over the landscape. But these weren't just temples for worship, at least not in the way we understand it today. They were the literal residences of the Anunnaki. They were their command centers, their laboratories, their administrative hubs. Each ziggurat was a miniature palace, a fortress, and a direct link to their advanced technology. The Anunnaki lived among the humans, not in some distant heaven, but in these monumental structures visible to all, a constant reminder of their presence and power. This direct physical presence is crucial. The Sumerians didn't just believe in their gods, they saw them, they interacted with them. They received direct orders from them, and the purpose of these cities was clear: to organize and manage humanity for the Anunnaki's benefit. The vast network of canals, the sophisticated irrigation systems, the granaries, all were designed to support a massive coordinated labor force. To manage this burgeoning population and its output, the Anunnaki introduced sophisticated societal structures. We see the birth of the priest-king system. The Anunnaki, while present, weren't going to micromanage every human task. Instead, they appointed human intermediaries, individuals chosen for their intelligence, loyalty, and organizational skills. These were the first kings, the first priests. Their authority wasn't divinely inspired, it was divinely delegated. They were stewards, managers, direct representatives of the Anunnaki, tasked with ensuring the smooth operation of the mines, the fields, and the construction projects. These priest-kings were responsible for collecting tribute, organizing labor battalions, and maintaining law and order. Laws, by the way, that were often dictated directly by the Anunnaki themselves. Think about the Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the earliest known legal codes. We're told these laws were given by the gods, and in the context of the Anunnaki, that wasn't a metaphor. It was a statement of fact. They were the lawgivers, establishing the rules that would govern humanity's interactions and, crucially, its service to them. This wasn't just about controlling people, it was about optimizing their potential. To make humanity a more efficient workforce, the Anunnaki bestowed other gifts, writing for instance. Cuneiform, the world's first writing system, emerged in Sumer. Why? To keep records of labour, of tribute, of resources, of astronomical observations that allowed for precise calendars, essential for agriculture and logistics. This wasn't for poetic expression initially, it was for accounting, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy. These weren't accidental discoveries. They were taught. The Sumerians' unparalleled advancements weren't just the product of their own ingenuity. They were the direct result of Anunnaki instruction, designed to make humanity a more sophisticated and productive resource. Imagine being taught advanced engineering by beings who could fly through space, who understood the very building blocks of life. The relationship then was clear. Humanity existed to serve. Our purpose was to provide the Anunnaki with gold, with food, with comfort. We were a functional workforce, a divine solution to a labour problem, and while the memory of the flood lingered, a terrifying reminder of the gods' power, the daily reality was one of constant demanding labour, directed from the towering ziggurats. This wasn't a benevolent relationship, not in the way we typically envision gods. It was a transactional one. The Anunnaki provided the knowledge, the protection, the societal structure. Humanity provided the tireless hands, the sweat, the output. And failure to comply carried the weight of divine wrath, a wrath humanity had seen unleashed with devastating consequences. So, the world was reborn, but it was a world where the line between ruler and ruled, creator and creation, was stark and unwavering. The Anunnaki had survived their near catastrophe, and humanity, their indispensable asset, was now firmly entrenched in its role. But even in this meticulously ordered world, the Anunnaki were not monolithic. Their internal politics, their rivalries, their very human-like emotions would continue to play out, shaping the destiny of their human subjects in ways that would leave an indelible mark on our history, our myths, and our very understanding of who we are. The stage was set for a new era, an era of unprecedented human advancement, driven by the demanding, often conflicting wills of the gods who still walked among us. And as we'll discover, their story was far from over. Welcome back to Dreamy Mystery, where we peel back the layers of history to uncover the stories that make no sense, unless you look at them through a different lens. Last time, we left humanity in a precarious but ultimately crucial position. They had survived the Great Flood, not through divine benevolence, but because the Anunnaki, particularly Enki, realized they were indispensable. Humanity was the workforce, the solution to the gods' labour crisis, and without them, the gold mines would lie dormant, and Nibiru's atmosphere would remain unprotected. So, in the post-flood world, the Anunnaki didn't just allow humanity to survive, they actively engineered their resurgence. Think about that for a moment. This isn't just about a god deciding to be nice. This is about an advanced species making a strategic investment in their most valuable asset. The gifts they bestowed upon humanity, which we touched upon, weren't acts of charity. They were sophisticated tools, meticulously handed down to optimize their human workforce, to make them more efficient, more productive, and more compliant. Let's break down these gifts. because their true purpose reveals the cold, hard logic of the Anunnaki. First, there was writing, cuneiform. We're often taught this was a monumental leap for human communication, and it was. But from the Anunnaki perspective, what was its primary function? Record keeping. Imagine overseeing a vast network of mines, agricultural fields, and construction projects. You need to track output, allocate resources, manage inventories, and keep tabs on labor. Cuneiform tablets became the ultimate administrative tool, allowing the Anunnaki to manage their earthly enterprise with unprecedented precision. It wasn't about poetry or philosophical treatises initially. It was about ledgers, quotas, and decrees. Then there was mathematics and astronomy. Again, these sound like pure intellectual pursuits, right? But for the Anunnaki, they were operational necessities. Mathematics for engineering monumental structures, calculating yields, and managing trade. Astronomy for scheduling. Think about it. When do you plant crops for maximum yield? When are the optimal times for certain mining operations? Perhaps tied to celestial alignments or seasonal changes. The Anunnaki, with their advanced understanding of celestial mechanics, taught humanity how to read the stars, not for spiritual enlightenment, but for practical planning. It created predictable cycles for labor, ensuring a steady flow of resources and tribute. And metallurgy? The ability to work with metals transformed human tools, weapons, and construction. But who benefited most from more efficient tools? The ones demanding, the labor. Stronger picks for mining, more durable plows for agriculture, better implements for building their colossal ziggurats. Humanity was becoming a finely tuned machine, each advancement a cog in the larger Anunnaki industrial complex. This entire framework, this meticulously constructed civilization, wasn't just inspired by the gods, it was designed by them. The very first cities, Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Nippur, weren't organic developments. They were planned settlements, each serving a specific function within the Anunnaki's global operation. The ziggurats, those massive stepped pyramids, weren't just temples in the abstract sense. They were the literal residences and command centers of the Anunnaki on Earth. Imagine walking through one of these ancient cities, looking up at a towering ziggurat, knowing that within its walls lived a flesh and blood god, observing, dictating, present. This brings us to the internal dynamics of the Anunnaki themselves, because the uneasy truce that followed the flood didn't magically erase their rivalries. Enlil, still resentful and wary of humanity, maintained his position as the supreme commander on Earth, focused on order and strict adherence to his decrees. His domain often represented the more militaristic and uncompromising aspects of Anunnaki rule. Enki, ever the scientific innovator and the one who had saved humanity, continued to be their patron, often acting as an intermediary, bestowing knowledge and guiding their development. But even Enki's, quote 41, was always in service of the larger Anunnaki agenda. He needed humanity to be intelligent and capable enough to perform their tasks. Other Anunnaki, like Nana, the moon god, took patronage over specific cities, establishing their own local cults and demanding specific forms of tribute and service. Ur, for example, became a city dedicated to Nana, its great ziggurat a testament to his power and presence. These individual Anunnaki lords, while theoretically subservient to Enlil, often had their own agendas, their own preferences, and their own rivalries. This created a complex political landscape, not just for the gods, but for the humans caught in their orbit. A city's prosperity could rise or fall based on the favour of its divine patron or the shifting allegiances among the Anunnaki Council. To maintain order and ensure humanity functioned according to their design, the Anunnaki introduced a system of Quote 42 known as the Me. This isn't just a set of laws. The Me were the fundamental operating principles of civilization itself. Think of them as the source code for Sumerian society. They encompassed everything: kingship, priesthood, various crafts and skills, music, justice, sexual intercourse, even the destruction of cities. Enki, being the god of wisdom and crafts, was often depicted as the keeper and bestower of these Me. Imagine Enki, not as a mystical figure, but as a project manager distributing standardized operating procedures. He would grant specific Me to different cities or individuals, thereby defining their roles, their capabilities, and their place within the Anunnaki system. If a city received the Me of kingship, it meant they were sanctioned to establish a human ruler, a priest-king, who would act as a direct liaison and administrator for the gods. If another city received the Me of brickmaking, they would specialize in construction, contributing to the monumental building projects. These priest-kings were not absolute monarchs in the human sense. They were stewards, chosen by the Anunnaki to manage the human workforce and ensure the continuous flow of tribute and labor. Their authority was derived directly from the gods, and their primary duty was to serve the Anunnaki's will. They oversaw the collection of offerings, organized the labor battalions, and maintained the elaborate rituals designed to appease and honor their divine overlords. This system ensured that the Anunnaki maintained direct control without having to micromanage every aspect of human life. They had their human middle management. The structure of this human society was therefore incredibly pragmatic. It was a hierarchical system built around service to the gods. At the top were the Anunnaki themselves, residing in their ziggurats, demanding worship and resources. Below them were the priest-kings, their human representatives, who interpreted divine will and administered the cities. Then came the priests, scribes, and skilled artisans, all serving the temple-state complex. At the base was the vast majority of humanity, the farmers, laborers, and soldiers, whose lives were entirely dedicated to sustaining the Anunnaki and their earthly operations. This wasn't a society built on abstract faith in an unseen deity. This was a society built on the very real, very tangible presence of demanding, powerful beings who lived among them, ate their food, drank their offerings, and directly dictated their lives. The fear of divine wrath was not an abstract concept. It was the fear of a physically powerful entity who could, and often did, unleash devastating consequences for disobedience. Think about it. A god could literally walk out of their ziggurat, demand an accounting, and if displeased, destroy a harvest or punish an entire city. This isn't myth. This is a very literal, almost industrial form of governance. The Anunnaki's influence was pervasive. Every aspect of human life, from the planting of crops to the administration of justice, was imbued with their presence and their purpose. They provided the framework, the technology, the organization, all designed to make humanity a perfectly functional, self-replicating workforce. Humanity was thriving in a way, but within very strict parameters. They were given just enough knowledge and autonomy to be efficient, but never enough to challenge the authority of their creators. But here's where things get truly interesting. Even with all this meticulous planning, all this divine oversight, the sheer scale of human interaction, the inherent complexities of societal growth, and the ongoing rivalries among the Anunnaki themselves were creating subtle cracks in the meticulously crafted facade. Humans, despite their engineered purpose, were multiplying at an astonishing rate. Their cities were growing, their innovations, even if guided, were becoming more sophisticated, and the Anunnaki, while powerful, were not omnipotent. They had their own limitations, their own squabbles, and their own ultimate goal, the preservation of Nibiru, which remained paramount. What would happen when humanity, now equipped with the tools of civilization and a growing population, began to chafe under the constant demands? What would happen when the internal politics of the Anunnaki became so tangled that it spilled over into human affairs, pitting city against city, or even God against God? The stage was set for a new era, one where the relationship between creators and created would become even more complex, even more volatile. The story of gods walking among us was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning to unfold its most dramatic chapters. We'll explore those next time, as humanity begins to navigate the treacherous waters of divine politics and their own burgeoning self-awareness. Welcome back to Quote 43, where we peel back the layers of history, not just to understand the past, but to question what we think we know about it. We've journeyed through the creation of humanity, the devastating flood, and the reluctant decision by the Anunnaki to let their workforce survive. Now, as the waters receded and the first rays of a new sun touched the Mesopotamian plains, a different kind of storm was brewing, one of ambition, rivalry, and the relentless pursuit of a singular precious element. Think about it. A world reborn, humanity rebuilding, but under the watchful, demanding eyes of their creators. The Anunnaki had given us the quote 44 of civilization, agriculture, writing, mathematics, metallurgy. But these weren't acts of benevolence born of newfound affection. Oh no, these were strategic investments, carefully calculated to optimize a very specific outcome. We're talking about a divine project management team, and humanity was their most versatile tool. The core objective, remember, hadn't changed. Nibiru, the Anunnaki's home planet, was still gasping for its atmospheric gold shield. Earth's gold was the solution, and humanity, the Lulu Amelu, was the engine to extract it. This wasn't just about survival for Nibiru. It was about the power that gold represented, and the Anunnaki knew it. What's genuinely fascinating, and frankly, a little unnerving, is how the Anunnaki's internal dynamics directly shaped our early history. We're not talking about a monolithic, harmonious pantheon. Far from it. The Anunnaki were a family, yes, but a deeply dysfunctional one, riddled with rivalries, power struggles, and ancient grudges. And at the heart of it all, as always, were the two titans, Enlil and Enki. Enlil, the commander, the stern taskmaster who had decreed humanity's annihilation, was still reeling from Enki's blatant defiance during the flood. His worldview was simple: order, control, and absolute adherence to the mission. Humanity was a labor force, nothing more, and he viewed their burgeoning numbers with suspicion, a potential threat to the carefully constructed hierarchy. For Enlil, every human innovation, every step towards greater autonomy, was a cause for concern, a deviation from their divinely appointed purpose. He saw humanity as a necessary evil, a tool to be wielded, not nurtured. Enki, on the other hand, the brilliant scientist and engineer, the one who had literally designed humanity, held a more complex view. Perhaps it was a creator's pride, or a scientist's curiosity in the evolution of his own experiment. He saw potential in humanity, not just for brute labour, but for ingenuity, for problem solving. While still firmly dedicated to the gold mission, Enki often seemed to push the boundaries of what humanity could do, subtly granting them knowledge, perhaps even seeing them as a means to achieve his own ambitions within the Anunnaki power structure. His domain, the Abzu, was not just associated with the deep waters, but with the deep mines, the very heart of the gold extraction operations. It was here that much of the initial critical work was overseen. These aren't just abstract theological debates. Their disagreements had tangible consequences for humanity. When Enlil pushed for harsher controls, for more rigorous oversight of human populations and their output, it was Enki who might subtly introduce a new agricultural technique, or a more efficient mining tool, easing the immediate burden while simultaneously increasing productivity. It was a delicate dance, a cosmic game of chess where human lives were the pawns. Consider the Adrasast quote 45 we discussed. Agriculture. This wasn't just so humans could feed themselves, it was to ensure a stable and abundant food supply for both the human workforce and, crucially, for the offerings demanded by the Anunnaki. No food, no offerings. No offerings, unhappy gods. And unhappy gods, as we've seen, could be catastrophic. Writing, cuneiform. What was the first widespread use of cuneiform? Not poetry or philosophy, but record-keeping. Inventories of grain, tallies of labour, lists of tribute, legal codes dictated by the gods themselves. It was the ultimate administrative tool, allowing the Anunnaki and their priest-kings to meticulously track every output, every resource, every human. It was the divine ledger, ensuring maximum efficiency and accountability. Mathematics and astronomy. These weren't for abstract contemplation, they were for precision. Precision in irrigation, in architectural design for the monumental ziggurats and temples, and critically, in establishing calendars for agricultural cycles and religious festivals. But perhaps even more profoundly, astronomy was vital for tracking celestial bodies, possibly even Nibiru itself, and understanding the cosmic alignments that dictated the Anunnaki's presence and their grand timeline. Metallurgy. This is where the rubber met the road. The ability to extract and refine metals was paramount to the gold mission. Humanity, guided by Anunnaki overseers, learned to dig deeper, to process ore more efficiently, to forge tools that could withstand the incredible demands of mining. They were literally forging the means for Nibiru's salvation, one pickaxe and smelting furnace at a time. The urgency of the gold problem for Nibiru was the constant driving force behind every Anunnaki decision. The need was not diminished, it was intensified by the passage of time. The lower-ranking Igigi, who had initially performed the arduous mining, were still present, but their numbers were fewer, and their role had shifted more towards oversight and specialized tasks. It was humanity, the Lulu Amilu, who now bore the brunt of the heavy labor in the vast mines across the Abzu, in what we now call Africa, and other resource-rich regions of Earth. Imagine the scene. vast mining operations like nothing humanity had ever conceived, stretching across continents. Human labourers, directed by the imposing figures of the Anunnaki and their Igigi lieutenants, toiling under the relentless sun or deep within the earth. The gold, once extracted, was meticulously processed, purified, and then transported, likely by specialized Anunnaki craft, to collection points, perhaps even directly to celestial vessels for transport back to Nibiru. This wasn't a quaint artisanal pursuit. It was an industrial-scale operation, managed by beings with technology far beyond anything humanity possessed. The priest-kings, those human intermediaries we talked about, played a crucial role in maintaining this system. They weren't just spiritual leaders, they were managers, administrators who enforced the Anunnaki's will, collected tribute, and ensured the smooth flow of labour and resources. They lived in the shadow of the monumental ziggurats, those towering stepped pyramids that were the literal residences and command centres of the Anunnaki. These structures weren't just temples, they were communication hubs, observation posts and power centres, constant reminders of the divine presence and authority. Humanity, in this era, perceived their gods as demanding, powerful, and sometimes capricious rulers. They were beings of immense power, yes, but also of flesh and blood, who ate, drank, quarrelled, and required constant service. The relationship was transactional: obey, labour, offer, and in return receive the gifts of civilization, protection from chaos, and the promise of continued existence. There was no room for questioning, no space for doubt. The me, the divine decrees, were absolute law. But here's where it gets truly intriguing. Humanity, despite being engineered for servitude, was also advancing. The very gifts meant to optimize their labor were also awakening their minds. They were learning, observing, and perhaps slowly starting to understand the patterns, the demands, and even the subtle conflicts within their divine overlords. The Anunnaki had given humanity the tools of civilization, but they might have underestimated the capacity of their creation to adapt, to grow, and perhaps one day to question the very nature of their servitude. The stage was set for a complex, unfolding drama. The gold was still needed, the rivalries among the Anunnaki still simmered, and humanity, the engineered workforce, was quietly, relentlessly evolving. What happens when the tools become too intelligent for their masters? What happens when the engineers begin to see their creation take on a life of its own? These are the questions that will drive our story forward as we delve deeper into the Anunnaki's grand experiment and humanity's unexpected journey towards something far greater than mere labour. Join us next time as we explore the burgeoning cities, the escalating demands, and the seeds of a rebellion that would shake the very foundations of this divine human pact. And so, we arrive at a fascinating yet deeply unsettling juncture in our story. Humanity, freshly spared from the Great Flood, was not just rebuilding, it was thriving. The Anunnaki, in their pragmatic wisdom, had bestowed upon us the very tools necessary for large-scale civilization: agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy. We were, by all accounts, an industrial-scale workforce, rapidly multiplying and meticulously organized within the burgeoning city-states of Sumer. But here's the thing, and this is where the conventional narrative of benevolent gods utterly falls apart. These gifts weren't given out of pure generosity. They were strategic investments. Humanity wasn't just a workforce. We were becoming an increasingly sophisticated workforce. And within the Anunnaki pantheon, this very sophistication began to expose and exacerbate fissures that had always existed. Think about it. You have a group of immensely powerful, technologically advanced beings, all from the same royal lineage, all with their own ambitions and perspectives, suddenly forced to coexist on a foreign planet, managing a resource extraction operation under immense pressure. What do you get? Not a harmonious council, not a unified front. You get politics. You get rivalry. This is where the true complexity of the Anunnaki story reveals itself, because their squabbles weren't just petty disagreements. They were tectonic shifts that shaped the very bedrock of early human civilization. We've already seen the fundamental philosophical divide between Enlil, the stern disciplinarian, the commander focused on order, efficiency, and strict adherence to protocol, and Enki, the brilliant scientist, the engineer, the one who saw potential in his creations, even when it meant bending the rules. Post-flood, with humanity back on track, this tension didn't subside, it intensified. Enlil, ever the pragmatist, viewed humanity as a resurgent labour force, a tool to be managed. His concern was output, control, and ensuring the steady flow of gold back to Nibiru. He saw the burgeoning cities, the meticulous record-keeping, the advanced agricultural techniques, and he saw efficiency. He wanted humanity to remain obedient, productive, and above all, subservient. His decrees, the me, were about establishing hierarchy, laws, and the strict protocols of worship and tribute that kept the human machine running smoothly for the Anunnaki. Enki, on the other hand, had a different vision. He was the one who had genetically engineered humanity, who had saved them from the flood, who had given them the initial sparks of knowledge. He understood their potential. While he absolutely needed them for the gold, he also seemed to take a certain pride in their development. Perhaps he saw them as more than just automatons. Perhaps he envisioned a more complex partnership, or at least a more intelligent, adaptable workforce. He continued to subtly guide human progress, bestowing knowledge that sometimes went beyond mere practical necessity, sparking curiosity, encouraging innovation. This wasn't just a difference of opinion, it was a fundamental clash over the future of humanity, and, by extension, the future of the Anunnaki mission on Earth. Each of these powerful beings had their own sphere of influence, their own favoured cities, their own priest kings on Earth, who acted as their direct representatives. Imagine the confusion for early humanity. One city, under the patronage of Enlil, might emphasize rigid adherence to law, military discipline, and the construction of massive defensive walls. Its priest kings would be stern, unyielding, demanding absolute obedience to the divine will as interpreted by Enlil. Another city, perhaps dedicated to Enki, might foster innovation, scientific inquiry, and a more nuanced approach to spiritual matters, allowing for greater intellectual freedom. Its leaders might be more focused on technological advancement and the exploration of new ideas. This isn't just speculation. This is what we see reflected in the archaeological record and the ancient texts. The distinct characteristics of different Sumerian city-states, their varying mythologies, their shifting alliances and animosities, they weren't always purely human-driven. What if these early human conflicts, these ancient wars between city-states were not just about land or resources, but were actually proxy battles, reflections of the deeper celestial rivalries among the Anunnaki themselves. When the texts speak of gods, quote 49, for control over a region, or one deity, quote 50, a city favoured by another, we tend to dismiss it as poetic metaphor. But what if it was literal? What if these, quote 51 des, were actively manipulating their human proxies, using their cities, their armies, their resources, to gain an advantage in their own internal power struggles? The ultimate goal, remember, remained the same for all of them, the gold for Nibiru. But the methods and the control over that process became a point of contention. Who would control the richest minds? Who would command the largest human workforce? Who would dictate the terms of humanity's existence? Consider Tanana, the moon god, Enlil's firstborn son, and the patron deity of the great ziggurat of a monumental structure, was his earthly residence, his command centre. Nana's rule through his priest kings would have reflected Enlil's values, order, tribute, and the efficient administration of a vast empire. Became a hub of trade and administration, a powerful city-state, a testament to structured hierarchical rule. Then you have Inanna, Ishtar in later Akkadian texts, Nana's sister, the goddess of love, war, and fertility, a formidable and often volatile figure. She too had her favoured cities, like Uruk, where she held immense sway. Inanna was known for her fierce independence, her ambition, and her willingness to challenge even the highest authorities among the Anunnaki. Her influence would have fostered a different kind of human society, perhaps more dynamic, more prone to expansion and conquest, reflecting her own warrior spirit. These divine personalities, with their very human-like flaws and ambitions, weren't just distant figures. They were present. They were literally walking among the humans, issuing commands, bestowing blessings, and delivering curses. And their interactions, their alliances, and their feuds had direct, tangible consequences for every man, woman, and child in Sumer. This wasn't just about religious belief. It was about political reality. The priest-kings, those human intermediaries, were not just spiritual leaders. They were managers of massive industrial complexes, overseers of vast agricultural networks, and commanders of armies. Their legitimacy, their power, came directly from their divine patron. And if their patron was at odds with another deity, then their city-state, by extension, was at odds with the other city-state. This is why the Sumerian king lists, which often describe periods of various cities holding, quote 52, can be interpreted through a new lens. Was it simply the rise and fall of human dynasties? Or was it the ebb and flow of power among the Anunnaki, with their favoured human proxies ascending and descending in influence? The me, those divine decrees that Enki had secured and distributed, became tools in this power struggle. They weren't just abstract concepts of civilization. They were specific protocols, technologies, and social structures. One Anunnaki might empower a city with the me of metallurgy, giving them an advantage in tool-making and warfare. Another might grant the me of organized religion, solidifying their spiritual authority. These were not just gifts. They were strategic assets, distributed to favored factions, creating imbalances and fostering competition. The constant pressure from Nibiru, the need for gold, hung over them all like a perpetual storm cloud. It was the ultimate motivator, the reason they were on Earth in the first place, and the reason their rivalries became so intense. Control over the gold mines, control over the labour force, control over the logistics of transporting the precious metal. These were battles fought not just on the ground, but in the halls of the Anunnaki Council, and ultimately through their human proxies. We often look at the history of ancient Mesopotamia and see the rise of empires, the invention of writing, the development of law codes, and attribute it all to human ingenuity. And while human ingenuity was certainly a factor, we must also consider the Anunnaki perspective. They engineered us, they guided us, and they used us. Our civilization was, in many ways, a reflection of their needs, their technologies, and their complex, often fractious internal dynamics. So, as humanity flourished, building ever more impressive cities, developing increasingly sophisticated systems, and multiplying across the Fertile Crescent, they were doing so under the watchful, often competing eyes of their creators. The gods were not just observing, they were actively shaping, manipulating, and in some cases weaponizing human civilization. This intricate dance of divine rivalry and human development set the stage for even greater conflicts. What happens when these powerful, self-interested beings, with their advanced technology and their human-like emotions, push their proxies too far? What happens when humanity, engineered for obedience but now armed with knowledge, begins to truly understand the nature of its creators? That, my friends, is where our story gets even more complicated, and where the line between myth and a very alien reality becomes incredibly thin. The stage is set for a confrontation, not just between humans, but between the very forces that shaped our earliest history. And humanity, unknowingly, is about to be caught in the crossfire of a divine war. All right, let's continue our journey, shall we? We've navigated the Great Flood, witnessed humanity's miraculous survival, and watched as the Anunnaki, ever pragmatic, guided our ancestors into a new organized world. A world of cities, laws, and the relentless pursuit of gold. But if you were paying close attention, you'd know that beneath this veneer of divine order, something far more volatile was brewing. We left off with humanity rapidly advancing thanks to the Anunnaki's strategic, quote, 54, agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy. These weren't just benevolent presents. They were calculated investments, designed to make humanity a more efficient, productive workforce. Think of it like this. If you're going to build a sprawling, complex operation for resource extraction, you need smart, organized labor, and that's exactly what the Anunnaki were cultivating. But here's the thing about cultivating intelligence. Even if it's for a specific purpose, it rarely stays confined to the parameters you set. Humanity, once a primitive worker, was becoming something more. They were learning, adapting, and perhaps even beginning to interpret the world around them in ways their creators hadn't entirely foreseen. And all the while, the Anunnaki themselves were far from a unified front. Our story, remember, isn't just about the gods and their creations. It's about the drama within the divine family itself. The fundamental, almost visceral rivalry between Enlil, the stern commander, the one who saw humanity as a necessary evil, a tool to be strictly managed, and Enki, the brilliant scientist, the creator who, despite himself, seemed to harbour a subtle, almost paternal affection for his work. This wasn't just a philosophical disagreement, It was a power struggle, a clash of ideologies that would soon tear through the very fabric of their dominion on Earth. Enlil, from his central command post in Nippur, viewed Enki's land, quote 55, bestowal of knowledge with growing suspicion. While Enki's cities like Eridu flourished with innovations in engineering, irrigation, and even early forms of scientific inquiry, Enlil saw a potential for chaos. He believed Enki was granting too much autonomy, too much understanding. Quote 56. Enlil would argue, his voice likely rumbling through the Anunnaki council chambers, quote 57. Enki, of course, saw things differently. He argued that a more sophisticated workforce was a better workforce. Smarter humans could devise more efficient mining techniques, build more robust infrastructure, and manage larger, more complex systems of production. He might have even hinted at a long-term vision, one where humanity, guided properly, could become more than just labourers, perhaps even stewards capable of self-governance under Anunnaki oversight, freeing the gods for other, grander tasks. But beneath that pragmatic argument, we suspect, was a deeper, unacknowledged pride in his creation. He had breathed life into them, and he saw their burgeoning potential. This ideological chasm manifested in very tangible ways for humanity. The cities patronized by Enlil, like his son Nana's Ur or Ninurta's Lagash, were characterized by strict hierarchies, rigorous labor schedules, and unwavering devotion to the gold mission. Their ziggurats were imposing, their laws unyielding, their focus relentlessly on output. In contrast, cities under Enki's influence, while still bound by the Anunnaki's will, often saw greater advancements in arts, sciences, and even a more nuanced approach to justice. The Mi, those divine decrees that formed the bedrock of civilization, were interpreted and applied differently, creating distinct cultural identities and, crucially, distinct technological advantages. Think about that for a moment. Your God, your creator, not only dictates your laws but also shapes your entire worldview, your technological capacity, and even your approach to knowledge. And when those gods are at odds, you become the battleground. The proxy wars began subtly. A dispute over a shared irrigation canal between a city loyal to Enlil and one favoured by Enki. A sudden, unexplained blight on the crops of a city that had recently refused to share its resources with a rival. But these skirmishes soon escalated. The quote 58 became weapons. A city with superior metallurgical knowledge bestowed by Enki might forge stronger tools, yes, but also more formidable weapons. A city with advanced astronomical understanding, perhaps from Nana, might predict a rival's movements with uncanny accuracy. Human kings, mere stewards for their divine patrons, found themselves caught in an increasingly complex web of divine politics. They were compelled to make demands, declare wars, and negotiate treaties, all under the unseen yet very real direction of their Anunnaki overlords. The lives of millions of humans were shaped, and often ended, by the squabbles of beings they worshipped as infallible. The tension reached a critical point, as our records suggest, when a particularly rich vein of gold was discovered in the territory, controlled by a city allied with Enki. This wasn't just another mine. This was a mother lode, promising to significantly accelerate the gold extraction for Nibiru. Enlil, ever focused on the mission, immediately demanded that the output be shared equally among all Anunnaki territories, asserting that the gold belonged to the collective, to Nibiru. But Enki, through his human intermediaries, resisted. He argued that the ingenuity and advanced techniques developed in his favoured cities were responsible for the discovery and efficient extraction. He suggested that a larger share of the gold, or perhaps control over its allocation, should be granted to his faction, as a reward for their superior methods. It was a direct challenge to Enlil's authority, a bold move that went beyond mere ideological debate. This wasn't just about gold, it was about prestige, about control, about demonstrating whose approach, Enlil's strict centralized management or Enki's more adaptive, knowledge-driven strategy, was superior. The Anunnaki Council, convened by Anu, became a stage for increasingly bitter arguments. Anu, the patriarch, struggled to maintain order. He reminded them of Nibiru's dire need, of the common goal that had brought them to Earth. But the old grievances, the deep-seated resentments, and the clash of personalities were too potent. We see glimpses of other Anunnaki taking sides. Some, like Ninhursag, the mother goddess, expressed concern for humanity, warning against pushing them too hard or setting them against each other. But her voice, often one of moderation, was frequently drowned out by the escalating rhetoric of the two primary contenders. The Igigi, the lower-ranking Anunnaki who had sparked the initial labor crisis, watched from the periphery, a silent, weary reminder of the burden of work that humanity now carried. The meeting deteriorated. Accusations flew. Old wounds were reopened, and the very foundations of their cooperative mission began to crack. Enlil, enraged by Enki's defiance, threatened to withhold vital resources from Enki's cities, to cut off their access to certain mi that facilitated their advancements. Enki, equally defiant, hinted at even more radical, quote 59, he could bestow upon humanity knowledge that might make them truly independent of Enlil's oversight. Think about the implications of that. Gods, threatening to weaponize knowledge against each other, using humanity as their pawns. The atmosphere in the council became thick with unspoken threats, with the chilling realization that their internal strife was on the verge of spilling over into something far more destructive. I quote 60, if it had ever truly existed beyond a fragile truce, was shattered. Our ancestors, toiling in the fields and mines, building the magnificent ziggurats, could only witness the fallout. Their cities found themselves suddenly at war with neighbours they had once traded with, their lives disrupted by famines or floods that seemed to have no natural cause. They were caught in the crossfire of a divine family feud, a struggle for power among beings whose very existence defined their world. The gold mission, the urgent reason for their presence on Earth, began to recede into the background, overshadowed by the personal power struggles of the Anunnaki. It was clear now, the Anunnaki were not just demanding labor, they were demanding loyalty, and they were willing to wage war, even among themselves, to secure it. And humanity, the ultimate prize in this divine game, was about to learn just how terrifying it was to be caught between warring gods. The stage was set, not just for another human conflict, but for a true divine war, the tremors of which would shake the very foundations of Earth. And we're just getting started. Welcome back to, quote, 61, where we peel back the layers of history and myth to find the truth that often lies hidden in plain sight. We've journeyed through the creation of humanity, the devastating deluge, and the Anunnaki's reluctant decision to let us survive, not out of benevolence, but out of absolute necessity. They had a mission, remember? gold for their home, Nibiru, and we, humanity, were the solution to their labour problem. But our story isn't just about a one-way street of divine command and human obedience. What happens when the created starts to evolve beyond their initial purpose? What happens when the gods themselves are too busy fighting each other to notice the quiet revolution stirring in the hearts and minds of their workforce? This, friends, is where our narrative takes a fascinating and, frankly, dangerous turn. We left off with the Anunnaki locked in bitter rivalries, particularly between Enlil, the stern commander who valued order and subservience, and Enki, the brilliant scientist who saw potential in humanity and continued to bestow radical gifts. These weren't just personal squabbles. These were ideological wars, proxy conflicts played out on the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, with human city-states as the unwitting pawns. Think about that for a moment. Imagine a world where the very gods you worship, the beings who literally designed your existence, are using your cities, your armies, and your lives as leverage in their own cosmic family feud. This wasn't some abstract spiritual conflict. This was real. The Sumerians, in their cuneiform tablets, meticulously recorded these events, but they interpreted them as the will of their specific patron deities, not as symptoms of a much larger, more complex struggle. The Quote 63 wasn't fought with Anunnaki warships in the skies, not yet anyway. Instead, it manifested as escalating tensions and outright warfare between cities like Lagash and Umma, or Kish and Ur. Each city had its Anunnaki patron, and each patron, whether Enlil aligned or Enki sympathetic, would empower their chosen city with specific me. Remember the me? Those divine decrees, those packets of knowledge and technology that governed civilization? Well, now they weren't just about agriculture and law. They were about dominance. Enlil, ever the pragmatist, saw the need for order. His favoured cities received me related to structured governance, military organisation, and efficient resource management. They became strong, disciplined empires, designed to extract maximum labour and gold for the Anunnaki's overarching mission. But Enki, with his penchant for innovation, wasn't just giving humanity agricultural techniques. He was subtly introducing advanced metallurgy, sophisticated mathematics, and even more nuanced understanding of the cosmos. These weren't just gifts, they were tools. Tools that could build, yes, but also tools that could question. Consider the implications of this. As human cities grew in power and sophistication, armed with these divinely sourced technologies, their conflicts became more devastating. A rivalry between two Sumerian city-states wasn't just a local spat. It was a reflection of the deeper, simmering tensions between Enlil and Enki. When one city developed a superior bronze alloy for weaponry, you can bet it wasn't just human ingenuity. It was an Enki-aligned Anunnaki subtly nudging them forward, giving them an edge in the proxy wars. And when another city, under Enlil's patronage, developed an unparalleled administrative system to mobilize vast workforces and resources, that too was a strategic advantage in the divine game. Humanity was caught in the middle, suffering the cycles of war and destruction, yet paradoxically advancing at an astonishing rate. Each conflict, each need for rebuilding, each push for dominance inadvertently spurred further innovation. We were learning, adapting, and perhaps most importantly, observing. This brings us to the second critical plot point, humanity's burgeoning self-awareness. We were created as a functional workforce, as to quote 65 species, but Enki's gifts, writing, mathematics, astronomy and metallurgy, were not just about making us more efficient gold miners or canal diggers. They were fundamentally about understanding. When you give a species the ability to record history, to calculate the movement of stars, to understand the properties of metals, you give them the keys to unlock more than just practical applications. You give them the capacity for reflection. The Sumerians weren't just blindly obeying anymore. They were developing complex legal systems, not just because the Anunnaki decreed it, but because they understood the logic of order. They were charting the heavens, not just to predict agricultural cycles, but because they saw patterns, cycles, and perhaps even a deeper cosmic order that transcended the immediate demands of their sky gods. Think about the great ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to Nana, the moon god. It was a massive stepped pyramid, a literal stairway to heaven, a residence for the divine. But it was also an astronomical observatory, a monumental feat of engineering requiring sophisticated mathematical and architectural knowledge. The humans who built it weren't just lifting stones, they were applying principles that Enki had bestowed. And in that application, in that intellectual engagement, they were becoming something more than mere labourers. They were becoming thinkers. This burgeoning self-awareness wasn't a sudden, overt rebellion. It was a subtle, internal shift. Humanity began to see the patterns in the Anunnaki's demands, the recurring cycles of their interventions, and perhaps even the inconsistencies in their divine behaviour. They were still devoted, still worshipping, still serving, but beneath the surface a quiet intellectual awakening was taking root. What happens, after all, when your workforce starts to understand the mechanics of your operation better than you intended? Now, let's circle back to the core reason the Anunnaki were here. Nibiru. What was its fate amidst all this divine infighting and human evolution? The urgent need for gold hadn't diminished. If anything, the proxy wars and the diversion of resources were hindering the primary mission. Precious gold, painstakingly mined by human hands, was being used not just for transport back to Nibiru, but also to fund and equip the proxy armies, to reward loyal human kings, and to maintain the elaborate Anunnaki infrastructure on Earth. The atmospheric crisis on Nibiru, the very reason for this entire grand expedition, was reaching a critical juncture. The Anunnaki Council, especially Enlil's faction, grew increasingly agitated. They were losing focus. Their internal squabbles were jeopardizing their home planet. The gold flow, while substantial, was not as efficient or consistent as it needed to be. The constant cycle of human conflict, while sometimes yielding new technologies, often resulted in destruction that set back mining and transport operations. This created a profound paradox. The very solutions the Anunnaki implemented, creating humanity, bestowing knowledge, engaging in proxy wars, were now becoming obstacles to their original goal. Enlil saw humanity's burgeoning self-awareness and the escalating conflicts as a dangerous distraction, a testament to Enki's reckless gifts. He wanted a docile, purely functional workforce. He wanted control. But Enki, ever the visionary, saw humanity's intellectual growth as an asset. He argued that a more intelligent, more capable humanity could actually accelerate the gold mission, devising more efficient mining techniques, better transport systems, and even contributing to the scientific understanding necessary for Nibiru's survival. His continued radical gifts were, in his mind, investments in a long-term solution, even if they came with the risk of increased human autonomy. The consequences of Enki's continued gifts were therefore twofold. On one hand, humanity was indeed becoming incredibly advanced, laying the foundations for civilization as we know it, developing complex societies, and mastering technologies that, by all conventional historical accounts, should have taken millennia longer to emerge. On the other hand, this rapid intellectual and technological development was directly challenging the Anunnaki's absolute authority and their initial premise of humanity as a mere tool. The ideological chasm between Enlil and Enki was widening into an abyss, and humanity was teetering on the edge of it. The Anunnaki had engineered us, nurtured us, and used us. But now they faced a critical decision. Should they rein in humanity, perhaps even revert them to a more primitive state to secure their control and focus on Nibiru, or should they embrace humanity's evolution, risking their own dominance for the potential of a truly collaborative, albeit unpredictable future? The clock was ticking for Nibiru. The gold mission was paramount, and yet the Anunnaki were fractured, their loyalties divided, their strategies clashing. Humanity, meanwhile, was growing stronger, smarter, and increasingly aware of the world around them, a world they were beginning to shape themselves. What would happen when these two forces, the desperate Anunnaki and the awakening humanity, reached their inevitable collision point? What would be the ultimate price of Enki's radical vision and Enlil's rigid control? The stage was set, not just for another flood or famine, but for a confrontation that would redefine the very nature of gods and men. This isn't just ancient history. This is the unfolding drama of our own origins, and the choices made then echo through the very fabric of our existence today. Join us next time as we delve into the dramatic escalation of these tensions and the profound, often tragic consequences for everyone involved. The clash between Enlil and Enki, we explained, wasn't just a philosophical disagreement. It was a schism that began to tear at the very fabric of Anunnaki society, reverberating through the burgeoning human civilizations they had so carefully and ruthlessly curated. This wasn't merely about which god held more sway in a particular city-state. It was about the direction of the entire gold mission, the purpose of humanity, and ultimately the future of the Anunnaki themselves. Think about it. You have a species engineered for labor, but one of its creators keeps adding new features, new capacities, new knowledge. What happens then? Do they remain a simple tool, or do they start to develop a mind of their own? Our story, the story of the Anunnaki, suggests the latter, and it created a crisis that even the gods struggled to contain. As the centuries stretched on, humanity, now equipped with the advanced agricultural techniques, complex mathematics, astronomical insights, and sophisticated metallurgical skills bestowed by the Anunnaki, gifts that were originally intended to make them better servants, began to use these tools in ways that transcended mere productivity. We saw the rise of intricate social structures, not just dictated by the priest-kings, but evolving organically within the cities. Art forms became more complex, depicting not only the grandeur of the gods but also the daily lives, the joys and the sorrows of humanity itself. There was a burgeoning sense of identity forming, an awareness that went beyond the simple directive to labor and worship. They started asking deeper questions. Why were they here? What lay beyond the stars? What was the nature of their own existence, their own consciousness? These weren't questions a mere quote 69 was supposed to ponder. This wasn't the Lulu Amelu of old, the docile, short-lived labourer. This was a species beginning to reflect. And this reflection, this glimmer of independent thought, was a direct consequence of Enki's continued, often clandestine interventions. He saw in humanity a spark, a potential that Enlil refused to acknowledge. Enki, the god of wisdom and water, the chief scientist, had always been fascinated by creation, by pushing boundaries. He'd given them the me, those divine decrees, those technological and conceptual blueprints, not just to make them efficient, but perhaps, in his own complex way, to see what they could become. He saw them as a testament to his own ingenuity, a living experiment that continued to yield fascinating, if unpredictable, results. He believed they could be guided, refined, perhaps even allied with, in the long run. Enlil, however, saw only deviation, a dangerous drift from the original mandate. For him, humanity was a means to an end. Gold for Nibiru. Every question, every independent thought, every cultural nuance that wasn't directly commanded by the Anunnaki was a direct threat to the established order. He saw Enki's, quote 70, not as benevolent guidance, but as reckless indulgence, jeopardizing the entire mission. Enlil, the stern commander, the god of the storm and the tablet of destinies, believed in absolute control, in unwavering obedience. He remembered the Agigi rebellion, and he saw in humanity's burgeoning consciousness the potential for an even greater, more catastrophic uprising. He argued that if humanity became too aware, too powerful, they might just decide they no longer needed their gods, or worse, that they resented their servitude. And here's where the practical implications became critical. The gold production. The very reason the Anunnaki were on Earth was suffering. The constant proxy wars between human city-states, fueled by the Enlil-Enki rivalry, diverted resources, disrupted supply lines, and crucially cost human lives. Fewer labourers meant less gold. The internal squabbles among the Anunnaki themselves, the bickering over territories, over the allocation of resources, over which faction held sway, further complicated matters. Anu, from his distant throne on Nibiru, was growing increasingly impatient. The atmospheric erosion on their home planet wasn't slowing down, it was accelerating. The demand for gold was more urgent than ever, but the supply was becoming erratic, unreliable. Imagine the reports filtering back to Nibiru. Quote, 71. Quote, 72. This wasn't just a local problem, it was a cosmic emergency. The Anunnaki had come to Earth to save their home, and now their own internal divisions, exacerbated by the very species they created, were putting that mission at risk. The tension reached a boiling point. The elders of the Anunnaki, the High Council, were summoned, not in the grand public temples, but in a secure, shielded chamber deep within the Iker, Enlil's sacred precinct in Nippur, a place considered the very, quote, 73. This wasn't a ceremonial gathering. This was a crisis meeting, a desperate attempt to salvage a failing mission and avert an even greater disaster. Anu, though not physically present, communicated his displeasure through the established channels, his voice echoing through the chamber, a stark reminder of the immense stakes. His message was clear. Resolve this, or face the consequences. He didn't care for their squabbles, he cared for Nibiru. Enlil stood before the council, his face etched with grim determination. Quote, 74. He boomed, his voice resonating with ancient authority. Quote, 75. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the council. Quote 76. The words hung heavy in the air, a chilling echo of the Great Flood. Enki, ever the strategist, countered with a different approach. Quote 77. He argued, his tone measured, persuasive. Quote 78. His proposal was radical, almost heretical. To see humanity as anything more than a disposable workforce was a profound shift in perspective. But the gold wasn't flowing. The internal strife was crippling. The Anunnaki were at a crossroads, forced to confront the unintended consequences of their own creation. The debate raged for cycles, punctuated by heated arguments, ancient grievances, and the stark reality of Nibiru's fading atmosphere. The Anunnaki, these powerful flesh-and-blood gods who had engineered life and shaped civilizations, were now deeply divided. Should they crush humanity's burgeoning spirit, risking a full-blown rebellion and the destruction of their labor force? Or should they embrace Enki's vision, allowing humanity to evolve further, risking an unpredictable future where their own dominance might be challenged? This was the precipice. The decision they were forced to make would not only determine the fate of humanity, but also define the very nature of their own divinity. For the first time, their power seemed less absolute, their control less certain. The gold mission, the very reason for their presence on Earth, was teetering on the brink, and the stage was set for a conflict far greater than any proxy war between human cities. It was a conflict that threatened to erupt into a divine war, a war between the gods themselves, with humanity caught directly in the crossfire. And as we'll explore next, the choices made in that council chamber would unleash forces that would forever alter the course of history, both human and Anunnaki.